let's walk through the legal model for IPTs. This comes from research into the gain of function for these tokens that a fellow mole, Chris Burns, and I did on request of the team. There's Chris right there. Hey, Chris. So Chris, also a lawyer, an IP lawyer, and joined us from DeSci.Berlin, and is a testament to how you can plug into this ecosystem from any of these points. Chris jumped into the DeSci.Berlin legal Discord, which was open, right? That channel was open, and said, "Yeah, I want to work on this task. Can I help you?" And I said, "Yeah." And he delivered really killer work product. And now here we are, two moles together in the laboratory, investigating how we can build a gain of function for IP NFTs. And it turns out that in order to turn an IP NFT into IPTs, in order to get this gain of function, all you need is that. That's a legal contract. The other two are smart contracts. And really, all you need is that one little piece of paper represented digitally in order to generate IPTs, which is why I said the real hard work is the smart contract work that Stefan and the development code team did. Because for us as lawyers, Chris and I, all we really had to do was draft this piece of paper and then understand how it integrates and how it helps to translate the IP NFT into IPTs. IP NFT, just briefly, represents an evolutionary step in legal contracts. Originally, we made contracts orally, just by talking about it, and that's still valid today. You can make an oral agreement with somebody, and it's going to be valid. Eventually, it became a piece of paper, and then a file in a digital folder, and now we can store it on this ultrasound money machine of Ethereum. And so what I'd like you to think of an IP NFT as is really just a logical next step in the evolution of a legal contract, from oral to paper to digital to now on-chain. And by having legal contracts on-chain, we have all these kind of extra functions like IPTs. But a reminder that an IP NFT, and this is a mistake a lot of people often make, it's not a funding device. Like, none of the IPTs, the 12 ones that have been minted to date, were used to fund the research. It wasn't like somebody minted an IP NFT and said, "Hey, buy my IP NFT and you fund my research." That's not how it works. The research was funded, existing, and then the research funder took that funding and registered their IP on Ethereum using the IP NFT. And that was actually pretty easy. And so big law lawyers out there who kind of prey upon crypto in many ways, and people who've tried to start a crypto startup will tell you it was like, oh, maybe 50K or 100K in legal fees just to form a Cayman Islands corporation or whatever bullshit people try to run you through. But in order to do this and make this happen, there's really just this one weird trick, and it's the one I showed you on an earlier slide, an assignment agreement. And so the trick to getting from digital file to ultrasound money file and IP NFT is this assignment agreement. And that agreement serves as kind of a bridge between your IP sponsoring research agreement and then the IP NFT on-chain on Ethereum. And so what you can do now with this gain of function for IP NFTs is you can mint IPTs. And you see there again is our friendly little legal agreement as the secret sauce. And so what IPTs are, they're fungible intellectual property tokens. We drop the NF, it's cleaner. And they're unique to their parent IP NFTs, which means if you have an IP NFT and you mint IPTs, then those IPTs are fungible amongst themselves, but only amongst themselves, not to other IPTs. And they're unique to their parents. And what they do together, and what I'll walk you through in the next few slides, is they create what are called IP pools. And in those IP pools, these IPTs have IP rights. In order to get those rights, we use two legal Legos. And I like to think of kind of legal Legos because of the DeFi Legos meme, and like how do we build a composable system. And it turns out that with these legal Legos, you can actually build your own Legos that you can replace into this system as a modular thing. And so legal Lego number one is called an adhesion contract. That's like a sticky contract that you don't have to sign, but it still gives you rights. It still sticks to you when you interact with it. A good example is like the swimming pool rules. Like if you ever go to Badenschiff here in Berlin, there's probably rules posted up on the wall that say you have to do X, Y, and Z. You can't take your pants off. And if you violate that rule, you actually violated the adhesion contract. And you can get kicked out. Similarly, with adhesion contracts online, like privacy policies or end user license agreements, or the CryptoPunk terms, or the Milady Viral Public License. These are contracts that stick to the users of software, stick to the holders of tokens, just by using the token, or holding the token, or using the software. And then we have IP pools. These are shared IP resources governed by their communities, and that are generally pro-competitive, efficient, in the public interest, and they're governed using the terms and conditions of licenses and sales, or they govern the terms and conditions, of licenses and sales of IP from the pool. And so you can imagine what happens when you take your IP NFT IP. So you've sponsored this research at the Korolchuk lab, you have all these rights to this cool IP, and what you've done when you've minted an IPT from that is you've created an IP pool that then all of the holders of tokens that represent membership in that pool get to govern together and get to control what happens to the underlying IP. So those two legal Legos. Number one, adhesion contract. IPT membership agreement that we'll go over in a moment, that's an adhesion contract that adheres to anybody who holds an IPT, whether they bought it, whether they participated in the primary auction, and it sticks to them in a few different ways. And then those IPTs, they create these tokenized IP pools. So, adhesion contracts, what is this? IPT membership agreement, again, is an IP pool adhesion contract. The same kind of adhesion contract you enter into when you walk into Badenship and it's posted on the wall. It sticks to you and it makes you a member of this IP pool. Number two is it gives you governance rights over all the IP in that pool. So whenever there's new IP, like a patent or something else that emerges from the research that's being done in the Korolchuk lab, that patent goes into the pool and it's governed by the pool token holders, the pool members who are holding their IPTs. Now you can find examples of adhesion contracts all over the world of software and all over the world of crypto. Any of you who are fortunate enough to hold a CryptoPunk or hold a Bored Ape or hold a Milady, you're subject to an adhesion contract that applies to that token that actually gives you IP rights. If you hold a punk or an ape, you have full commercialization rights to that punk and ape. So you can take it and put it on, as you've seen with apes, water, energy bars, as you've seen with punks, on different stuff. Because what Yuga Labs has done through their adhesion contract is they've said anybody who holds a punk or anybody who holds an ape now has the rights to full IP commercialization from that ape or that punk or that image. What Milady has done is a little bit different. They've attached something called a viral public license to their IP, which basically says, if you hold this, you don't have the rights to it, you don't have the commercialization rights. Actually, anybody can use it, anybody can take it, and if they do use it and they do take it, it infects the thing that they used it for, and it makes it uncopyrightable, which is a very interesting kind of approach. But as you can see, both of those things, they're just tokens. A Milady token and a Punk token, they're both just ERC-721s on Ethereum, a few lines of code. What makes them interesting and what makes them unique in the world of IP is this adhesion contract that attaches to them. And so what we've done is taken that same concept of adhesion contracts that Miladies have, that Bored Apes have, what Punks have, or that the Apple end user license agreement or the synthetic terms of use when you go into synthetics and you want to trade on leverage have. And we've applied that to these IPTs. So hopefully that explains to you just exactly how these IPTs are getting their IP rights. And it also helps you understand that it's not really a novel concept. It's pretty simple and pretty trivial. And it's kind of those one weird trick that lawyers hate. Second, legal Lego is these IP pools. We went over that, and it behooves us to go over it again, just so you really understand what you're getting yourself into when you're buying a VitaFast token or you're becoming a member of the pool. You don't want to go into the bottom shift, for example, and actually people can't take their pants off, and you didn't expect that. Now everybody's pantsless walking around. And so in this case, what IPTs do again is they make tokenized IP pools from IP NFTs. So all of those IP rights that the IP NFT holder had, which is the plenary right to any IP that emerges from the research, like Vita now, by sponsoring the Korolchuk lab research, has the rights to whatever longevity drug might emerge from that, which is super powerful. Like if the autophagy drug that Korolchuk is investigating is successful, it can be bigger than rapamycin, which is like, it's a huge drug. And so, it's this very, very powerful right, and by creating a pool of people that govern it, you've empowered a democratic process of many people to help to govern this very powerful core IP. And again, any patents that emerge and any IP registrations that emerge from the research, they go into the pool, they're governed by the pool members, in the IP pool. The IP NFT owner is actually the owner of the IP. The IPT holders just govern it. And this is an important point we can get to in the Q&A a little bit later, and we're fortunate to have Chris here to help explain it a little bit more. But the nuance is this. If you have multiple owners of a piece of intellectual property, it's also like having multiple owners of a piece of real property, a building. Any single owner has the right to lease it out to anybody or to sell it to anybody, which could be pretty fucked up because you have a ton of disputes. You could have people who are saying, I'm selling it to my friend, and nobody else who is an owner could stop that. And so by separating out the ownership right, which remains in the IP NFT holder, and the governance right, which goes to the IPT holder, what we've done is we've avoided that problem of co-ownership that plagues the IP world, and plagues the real property world too. You can find examples of other IP pools in the Creative Commons. Pretty popular one. Most people here have encountered or used work from the Creative Commons. In open source software itself is an IP pool. Corporations are also IP pools, so anybody who's a shareholder of a corporation or employee of a corporation, what they're doing when they create IP in the pursuit of their work, they're actually contributing that IP to the pool that the corporation owns. You know, it's not your IP that you build when you're working for your job. It's actually the corporation's IP. You help to govern that IP through the shares that you hopefully get as an employee, but you don't own the IP. The corporation owns it. It's governed by the pool. Another example is the medicines patent pool, and a pool of other medical data and patents that emerged during COVID to foster, again, collaboration within an industry to accelerate the pace of scientific innovation by sharing IP together and governing it together. The Model IPT Membership Agreement, this is our adhesion contract that we developed for the IPTs. But again, because it's just an adhesion contract, you can make your own. Just like Milady's stuck the biopublic license to Milady's, it's different from what Yuga did, sticking the Bored Ape terms to the Bored Apes. So we've stuck the IPT membership agreement to VitaFast, but you can make your own and stick it to your IPTs because it's an adhesion contract. It just adheres by being posted on the website, by being interacted with in voting, by as many places as possible. And one of the crucial things to getting an IPT membership agreement or an adhesion contract in general to adhere to someone is the number of interactions that they have. So, you know, if the user has 5 or 6 interactions with the contract, maybe when they purchased the IPTs, or they voted, or they went to the website, or they went to the token-gated chat, then it really sticks to them. The less interactions, the less sticky, which is tough. And so what this contract does is it gives people kind of these 4 categories of rights. 1, governance, which is governance over the licenses to the IP and the uses of the IP, and the terms of that, which may include the terms of royalties, as you can see on the right. And what we've done is we've not hard-coded royalties because we sought counsel from tier 1 law firms around the world before publishing this and releasing this. And what they said basically is this. If you hard-code royalties into your token, then you're likely releasing something that in Switzerland would be an asset token, or in the US would be a security. Which is fine, right? People have securities and trade securities all the time, but we don't want that to happen here because it would heavily restrict the ability for a token like this to be freely traded. And so the way that we solved for that, with the help of our legal advisors, is we deferred this royalty right to a later agreement among IPT holders, but still embedded the power to make that agreement into this adhesion contract. So what you can do as an IPT holder is vote on royalties, adopt an amended membership agreement with royalty rights, but you don't get them automatically. You have to work to get them. You also get access to the IP, and you have a duty of care to honor any agreement made pursuant to the IP. So now we get to like, how are we going to mint IPTs? And the dilemma of like, do I mint it through a DAO or do I mint it without a DAO? And let's just walk briefly through these kind of 3 other charts that help us to see the 3 models. So this is a DAO minting IPTs, sorry. So you have entities in the squares, you have legal contracts in the little dotted lines, and you have the cool funky shapes as smart contracts. So here you have a researcher who licenses IP through this first agreement, the IP license and sponsored research agreement, to a DAO. And then you have the DAO who's licensed the IP from the researcher, and they've tokenized their IP portfolio by this little agreement, the assignment agreement that we pointed out earlier. that assignment agreement mints an IP NFT, which registers the IP on chain. And then to mint IPTs from that, you have this third legal agreement between those two smart contracts, the IP NFT and the IPTs, and that's the IPT membership agreement, our IP pool agreement that we talked about a little earlier. And so in that big dotted line, that's what you have as a tokenized IP portfolio for your organization using the Molecule legal smart contract stack. But what if you don't have a DAO? You can have an IP holdco. And so what an IP holdco will do is replace the DAO. Say you're just like, you don't want to go through the trouble of starting a DAO, or maybe you feel like DAOs are too scary, or too innovative, or you're worried about liabilities, and you don't have the lawyers on hand to help walk you through those and make you feel safe. You can just form a holdco like an LLC and tokenize your IP portfolio of the LLC, a traditional IP holdco in the same way. But the problem is what I've circled in red in this slide, which is exactly what our friend from Pfizer talked about yesterday on main stage, which is overhead. As you can see, no overhead, overhead. And the overhead is the shareholders. And that can suck. So I prefer the DAOs minting IPTs, but there's also no DAOs. And say you don't even want an IP holdco. Maybe you're a researcher and you want to just raise money for your research. You can't do that necessarily with an IP NFT, right? Because it's not a fundraising device. You could just mint IPTs yourself. You're the researcher, you assign your rights, register them on chain using the IP NFT, and then, again, enter into that IPT membership agreement by clicking a few buttons, and you've generated this IPT pool to govern the IP on chain.
That you own as a researcher?
That the IPT holders govern, and that the IP NFT holder owns. So if you mint it to your own wallet, you're the owner of the IP, and then the IPTs, you'll distribute those generally to other people's wallets.
They're investors.
Yep, they could be investors, they could be your lab colleagues, they could be anybody who wants to help in the participation in the creation and the development of the IP.
Where does
IP
the money
development.
go then?
Sorry?
Where does the money go?
The money would go, in the event of a fundraise, the sale of IPTs, the money would go into the wallet that holds the IP NFT. Or the researcher could have a fiat bank account and sell IPTs for fiat, not do it on chain. And then they would hold that in their fiat bank account.
It's the most important, it's like the treasury management piece of like, I have to live, I have to pay for a lab, right? Versus, hey, I can have an NFT which holds the...
Yeah, that's a real problem. And the problem is the treasury management piece. Like, I have to live and pay for a lab.
In fiat.
In fiat, right? Well, MetaMask just introduced Sell, so you could just use it from your MetaMask and sell directly from your MetaMask to fiat, to any fiat bank account. And I think that kind of off-ramping solutions are emerging, and they're getting better and better. And I'm very optimistic that we'll see more and more kind of crypto native e-commerce, where it's like that meme like Neo, like what if I told you never have to sell? Because you can just use the crypto to pay your employees, to pay the lab. So this is an example of what we have: IP NFT and then the IPTs. This is the first IPT that was live, the VIA Fast. This is a picture of the crowd sale. It did great, and now it's sitting at 3x the price paid for the research. And so the way that it was valued, this IPT, when it had its original sale, was on the amount of money paid for the research to date. Because it's hard to value early stage IP. Like, how are you going to evaluate it? What are you going to do? What's the valuation metric? So it's the cost paid for the research.
Wow.
And that was the valuation. And now, where it's sitting now, it's actually valued by the market at 3x the cost paid for the research.
Right.
So that's the value. And it's still only about $1 million, which if you think about the potential value of an autophagy drug, it could be worth a lot more. It could also be worth, as Mike Moran said, 0, because it's 8 to 10 years out, so you never know. But interesting nonetheless that what the IPTs have done, in this case, is they've allowed this price discovery to happen in the market, in an open, free market, so that people can now say, well, we think this IP is going to be worth this much. People think the IP of VIA Fast, the work that Kurolchuk is doing, is worth $1 million. And that just wasn't possible before.
How did you get to $1 million?
So this is just a picture of the crowd sale, and you see the valuation on the crowd sale down here, the molecules valuation, that was the cost paid for the research.
Right.
And it is now freely trading the token. And if you look at the market cap of VitaFast, it's about $1 million. And so the actual valuation that the market is giving the IP is $1 million.
So like if you put 1 ETH, it'd be 3 ETH now.
Sorry?
So it's like worth 3 times what.
Yeah, right now it's, anybody who participated in the auction is up 3x, but with not financial advice, it could very easily go to zero.
Is it freely traded? Is it
It is freely traded, yeah. It's freely traded. And again, it could very much go to zero, as Mike Barad said, and I think he's super wise and probably right.
What amount of governance was sold?
Sorry?
What amount of governance?
So in this case, only 10% of the IPTs were sold. The other 90% was retained by VitaDAO.
Okay.
In my personal opinion, and this is my personal opinion, I think it should always be 100% that's sold. Yeah. And I think that the DAO should participate on the same terms as everybody else.
So VitaDAO recaptured its original investment and gave up. 10%.
No, actually VitaDAO, in this fundraise, there was only a goal of 19.06 Ether,
Okay.
and anything over that goal was actually refunded to all the participants.
Okay.
And so VitaDAO only raised the exact amount it needed for the next phase of research. And that was very important in the design, because we didn't want to have this speculative frenzy where an unlimited amount of funds was raised. We wanted to say, we know what the research milestone is, we know exactly how much it's going to cost to do this assay, and that's how much we're raising. We're not raising any more than that. And then everybody was refunded who bid higher than that. And then if they wanted to bid up the IP value, then they could in the open market rather than in the auction, which I think is more fair for participants.
And
yeah.
why is your opinion that selling 100% of the IPTs would be more wise? Couldn't VitaDAO just go on auction off some of that rest 90% that is remaining in the second round basically now?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think in terms of democratic principles, and I think it's just more fair for the DAO to distribute 100% of the governance power to everybody. By distributing 10%, they still retain control.
Right.
So it's like, well, what did I buy? Then, if I'm holding only 5% of the value or 5% of the governance rights, I don't have the power to determine who's the license holder.
But if Vita sold 100% of the governance, would they lose all their economics in that asset?
Well, they could participate on the same terms as everybody else, or the IPT holders could vote to mint new IPTs that represent and allocate those to VitaDAO, which is exactly what happened with the VitaDAO fair launch, right? Vita was 100% sold. All of the Vita supply was sold to participants, and then after that, participants said, you know what, let's mint more Vita and reward different groups or different parties. Same thing happened with TerraDAO. But wait, there's more. You thought that IPTs were all? They're not. Our moles are back. This is a stylized, it was a pretty good portrait of Chris and I working in our legal labs. You can see the law books behind us and the beakers in front of us. Those are the tokens, and the law books are all those contracts that we introduced to you earlier. And so we've been kind of back in the lab doing more gain of function research because, as you can see, IPTs is actually a relatively simple design on the legal front. It's an adhesion contract, it sticks to the token, pretty simple. Turns out that with this concept of adhesion contracts, we can go much deeper and we can go much further. And we can allow for IP NFTs to have a lot more utility than just minting one kind of token. We could go with a whole new kind of token. Tokens for delivery. You may be familiar with Unisocks, or a more recent iteration of Unisocks, which is Fumo. And so what each of those were, Unisocks being the first one, was a token you could buy and then at a later point redeem for a physical product. The price of the token was on a bonding curve, which is why you can see it reached this insane price. Current price of Unisocks, $27,000 for one pair of socks. You could redeem that socks token for the pair of Unisocks. It's been much higher than that in the past. And the Lady Fumo, a kind of recent iteration, is this doll. It's about 2 feet tall. You see the Coke can as a comparison. And it's exactly the same model. I think they even used the exact same smart contract, just copy-pasted it in the true spirit of crypto innovation. And
Is it the same as the hat DAO that guy was talking about?
I don't know if it's the same as the hat DAO, but it would be the same as doses of the drug. And so what you can imagine doing is taking that Unisocks model, or the Milady Fumo model, of pricing a token for the delivery of a future product on a bonding curve, and apply it to drugs, doses of drugs. I used here as an example T3, T4, which is the Herdal thyroid study that's under development now. What's really interesting is that they're doing their group buy right now, right? The actual drug is under development, and it's going to be distributed to the community members of Herdal who want to participate in the near term. So, as the first drug that is developed by BioDow and distributed to its community members, yeah. And that's coming, right? And it'll be like a cream you can rub on your head for the places that you want hair growth, or I guess elsewhere, if you wanted hair elsewhere. I personally put a bunch on my back. And then, with that drug, you regrow your hair. And the question is then like, well, how do we generate a really good market price? Like, could we have price discovery for the drug before it hits the market? Wouldn't that be interesting? And I think using these models of Unisox and Milady, we actually could do that in a relatively trivial way. Again, using an adhesion contract, and again, the hard work is all done by Stefan and co. as a smart contract. So I don't want to scare you in the back as our development team thinking, oh shit, now we have to develop a whole new set of smart contracts, but there is the copy, paste, innovate technique that is common in crypto as well. And I just wanted to leave you with this because I think it's personally a very interesting potential development, and hopefully it opens up the design space for you for IP NFTs. When you realize that this IP NFT, it's like this high value registration of IP that these DAOs have online, on chain, and you can't really do much with it until you start to add layers of utility, like IPTs, like potentially TFPs, and then on top of that, anybody who's interested, you can build prediction markets, so you can long short. You could, for example, say, I think the data is going to be bad, and I want people to express a bearish position to allow them to short this project because the data will be bad. You can build all kinds of cool stuff on top of that. So that's it. This Q&A QR code, it leads to a Google Doc where if you don't feel comfortable speaking your questions out loud, or you don't have time to speak your questions out loud, you can just write them in there, and I'll answer them in my own time. But hopefully we have a little bit of time, Leo, for a few questions at least.
Indeed, we do.
Cool, awesome. Well, thanks so much, and please shoot. Free legal advice.
Thank you, Leslie.
A rare opportunity to get free legal advice.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for the great talk. I want to know if there's any legal precedents regarding these IP NFTs, because if I look from the perspective of traditional IP, the level of detail is much less. It's more like I put a hypothesis out there, and this kind of, how does this even relate to real IP? Because there's nothing proven yet. Maybe everything doesn't work out. So is there even any IP? I haven't proven that something works or that this drug is effective.
Yeah, that's a great question. And so the question is there legal precedent for this kind of IP? And I'll bring you back to one of the earliest slides, which is this logical progression of evolution of legal contracts. And so I want to encourage you to look at IP NFTs as really just another step in how a legal contract can be stored. And so the precedent is there in that direct lineage of how contracts are formed. The only unique thing that IP NFT really brings to the table is the smart contract layer. It really is just inside of that a regular legal contract that has precedent that's built on hundreds or thousands of years of legal negotiation. So inside of that legal contract that's registered on Ethereum using the IP NFT is just your standard IP rights under the sponsored research agreement, because the agreement inside of it is a sponsored research agreement. And then your second question was a little bit different, which is, well, this is actually talking about future IP, right? There's no IP that exists right there. It's just you're sponsoring research and you're getting rights to whatever might emerge. And so I think your question there was more like, what about that?
That's pretty diffuse. There could be other stakeholders involved during the course of the project that should also get some share of the IP or...
Yep. And so that's where we came to IPTs. And so right now, right, you have a sponsor of research. In the case of the IP NFTs that have been minted, that research sponsor owns all rights to any IP that might emerge. And that's traditional. Like anybody who sponsored research has entered into a similar agreement, And as a scientist, it often sucks because you're giving away all the IP. And it's like, well, where's my share? And you have to negotiate maybe with the sponsor a share, but you don't always get it. And so what IPTs allow you to do is just to tokenize that share and say, well, actually, here it is. I know it's not much. It's just a symbolic representation of your IP rights, and It's governance, and you still have to govern in a royalty payment, but it's more than nothing. And I think these incremental steps are what's going to get us ultimately to the goal. Because again, like when you talk about an IP NFT, people are like, what the fuck is that? Like that sounds so weird and foreign and new. And hopefully this kind of this concept of this logical progression puts it into perspective a little bit and makes it like, actually this is just an incremental step towards an on-chain contract. Does that help answer your question at all?
Yeah, thanks.
Cool.
Hi, quick question here. Just something basic probably, but are all IP pool holders equal? And if they're not, where is that information defined?
All IP pool members are equal. They're fungible governance rights. But inequality comes from your token holders, right? Say you hold 50%, you have more rights. And to solve for that, I think we should rely on some of the things that Pooja highlighted in her presentation, which is like square rooting, quadratic voting, accounting for all different kinds of things that are another layer built on top of the voting, so that you don't just have majority control saying they can do whatever they want. We're going to license to this third party, and somebody who owns 5% has no say.
Hey, over here. Thanks for the talk. I guess my question is, how do you reconcile, how did, I guess, the legal agreements reconcile the inability for a court to order certain changes on Ethereum, right? And there are a bunch of technical edge cases as well, like what happens if IPT tokens or even the IP NFT itself exists on an EOA where the private keys are lost or somebody sends it to the burn address. How do you deal with these edge cases?
Yep. Your question is actually similar to, well, what if your IP contract gets burned? If it was on a piece of paper, right? Say you had a file cabinet, and in that file cabinet was your sponsored research agreement, and you had your rights there, and your house burned down, or your office burned down. Do you still have your IP rights? And the answer is yes, you do.
But how does the court enforce that outcome given the
Yes.
assignment agreement?
Yeah, and so what the court would do is they'd look at the history of negotiation between the parties. And they'd say, was there a contract, even though it was burned, even though the IP NFT was sent to the burn address, or they lost the keys to access the IP NFT, was there still a valid contract between these parties? And if there was, there's this history of negotiation, history of contracting, then the court would likely still enforce the intellectual property rights that the parties have, even though the actual IP NFT is burned, or the paper contract is burned, or gone. And I think your question gets at something, something even more, which is like, well, how can a court force, for example, a distribution of IPTs or denial of IPT rights to somebody who's holding them because they're holding this, this right that is immutable on Ethereum. They're holding this token, and the answer is actually built into the contract design. It's something that Chris and I were talking about probably an hour ago in DM. And if I may, I'd love to actually pass the mic to Chris to answer your question. If I don't want to put you on the spot, but I feel like you really do have a good answer to this question. So.
Sure, and it's, well, what we really try to do is just de-risk what's going to happen in a court and trying to kind of orient conflict that ends up becoming super fact specific when courts are actually going to look at whether there's a valid contract or sort of how to handle a tokenized form of this. Courts, we have several sort of layers of intervention. One is that the IPT regime is actually governed under ULEX 1.2. Just by show of hands, is anyone familiar with ULEX? It's this pretty cool, it's this, great, no one. It's essentially a library of common law principles that have been collected and curated by a legal academic who's really into crypto and wants to help support means for having communities use legal principles to sort of govern these things themselves, right? So, I mean, generally speaking, I think what will happen when an issue like this arises at some point, and the facts around that are going to be super material to kind of, I think, what looks like a just outcome. The first step is going to be to actually enable a step for conflict resolution. It's at least set up to do so right now, to have that be done probably on a DAO-wide basis. And any DAO, the idea here is to just align economic interests of the DAO and of IP NFT holders and then this whole IPT program to ensure that as repeat players, there's some sense of precedent and solving for sort of stopgap problems and things like this in a way that helps to build culture. And I mean, fundamentally, law, like if we went into a court and just asked the court to order some equitable injunction, which would say to someone, like a court could come in to an IPT holder and say, you have to do this or else we can seize property, or all the sort of things that the state does whenever it just issues some type of order. We essentially can have that be, like, that's a cultural kind of issue, right? That a court's going to do that in a way that makes sense inside the sort of political economy of the justice system. And we talk a lot about how that can get structurally messed up. But inside a DAO, I think there's a means where the community also wants this to work. If they want it to work, great. There's a few other steps legally between where we have applicable law, protections, and kind of duties of care that also help direct conflict in a way that defaults into law to try and spare a crisis, but those are probably longer, detailed deep dives to jump into based on facts. I don't know, that's probably a super long-windy answer, but I'm trying to orient the context in which we're playing.
And to add to that, if I may, I think that, like, specifically when we're talking about distribution of royalties, for example, to IPT holders, how do you have a court say that person is not a valid holder, they shouldn't receive royalties? And the answer is really in this extra social layer that comes with this governance, right? Say you have a governance vote that says, we just got $1 billion from selling the Coroltech IP, we want to distribute it to be the fast holders. If that vote passes, then the actual IPT holders may say, well, anybody who wants to collect royalties actually has to KYC an NDA. And if they don't KYC an NDA, they can't actually collect royalties through the portal, through the contract that you built through the portal. And so there you have a social layer built at the DAO level that helps to enforce that legal agreement to do X, Y, or Z in order to get your money. And so the IPT that you hold may actually be rendered invalid. And that also works for access to IP. So if you want to access IP, for example, that is confidential, related to the research project, and you have an IPT, you have the right to access IP. And so you go to the IP, you go to the data room and you say, listen, I have a token that gives me access to this, give me access, I want the confidential information. But the social layer would say, well, actually, you have to KYC an NDA if you want the confidential information, sorry. And so you, as an IPT holder, don't automatically get that right. You have the right to kind of take the steps and then get through to that ultimate layer of value, whether it's accessing data or whether it's getting paid. And just one more thing is to highlight the difference between the ownership of the document and the ownership of the right. A great example is like IP doesn't transfer through theft. So if somebody steals, unlike real property, which also doesn't really transfer through theft, somebody could steal your pen, it's not their pen. It's still technically your pen, and the court would say actually it's still your pen. Same with IP, right? There was this marketing scheme for Bored Apes where Seth Green said, oh, I lost my ape that is being used in this TV show, and I need it back, so otherwise the TV show can't be released. It's like that was bullshit, because actually he still owned the IP even though he didn't own the ape anymore. Because somebody stole it, he stole as the IP owner, because the IP doesn't transfer with the token, necessarily.
If I may,
yeah.
There is this really interesting tension that exists though, because you might highlight the one property of Ethereum that makes it interesting as a kind of the ability to enforce some set of application logic beyond the reach of any court.
Yeah.
And what you're saying, if I'm hearing it right, is that all of these technical frameworks, as much as you've kind of transplanted the storage of the record onto the blockchain, it's still entirely subservient to the rule of the court.
Yeah.
But there are some places where there's real conflict in those two systems.
Yep. Whether it's the court, an outside court, or the court within the DAO, whether it's a private court or the public court, it's still relying on the court. This whole system, and that's the problem.
Which court?
Yeah, yeah.
You know?
Right. Which court? And that it's a big problem, and it sucks because ideal world, royalties are hard coded. Ideal world, you take your IP NFT and you mint IPTs, and anybody who holds an IPT, they get a right to get paid if the IP NFT gets sold. Stefan actually wrote that code. And then in our consultation with lawyers, they were like, you can't do that if you want these things to be freely traded. And so I was like, okay, well, fuck you, but we have to do it this way. And it sucks, and hopefully, I'm very optimistic that it'll change. That you know, we'll get articulated regimes for securities that allow for them to be more freely traded and open, that enable automatic, hard-coded royalty rights and these kinds of rights. But we're not there yet.
Very last one, if I may.
Yeah, this is a great line of question.
If an IP NFT were to be lost, the court would obviously step in to, you know, I guess, enforce the ownership of that IP. But do the assignment agreement or whichever set of agreements are relevant here, do they make provision for the fact that in the IP NFT world, ownership of the IP could be reassigned because it is impossible to recover the original IP NFT, right, that may have been lost?
Yeah, they do. So like, and you can read the text of the assignment agreement, it's pretty clear on that. And I think Chris and I did a lot of thinking and making sure that the terms allowed for that eventuality of the loss of an IP NFT and the assignment of it to other people, the assignment of the rights. Yeah. And even before you get to the court, you still have this social layer. Like, you know, you can say, oh, I'm beat it out. I'm sorry, I lost your IP NFT, Roll Chuck. Can we just make a new one? Like, yeah, of course. You have the rights. Let's make a new one.
Okay, we got room for one last question, and it's going to be from here.
So we talked a lot about the beginning of life of projects, but a lot of biotech and projects in this world right now are kind of like coming to an end of life. So in my professional capacity, I've been chief risk registering officers of many type of projects in the medical circle, like medical devices, biotech, etc. And could this be something that a court could recognize when when a team needs to go through Chapter 11 reorg, and there's like this concept of the maximization of the state? Can a DAO come in to buy such an organization in Chapter 11 and then quickly do like a DAO reorg or an LLC that which then transfer all the assets to a DAO, which then goes into investors to collect investor pool? Doing a reorg, it takes a lot of time, and sometimes that diplo doesn't last the full cycle, and then the company just dies. But in a lot of these projects, right, then the IP gets lost or gets sold to someone who is kind of like malicious, or a big pharma is like, okay, I want this project to die, I'm going to buy it and close it off.
That's a really great question, and I gotta say, like, it's actually even beyond my understanding. Like, we don't even have a bankruptcy lawyer on our team yet, but one of my best friends is one, so I'll try to answer. And so I think what you're getting at is, like, is it possible to use this model for group buys of distressed IP?
Correct. And why I'm seeing this is because one of the concepts I had from even 2-3 years ago is that the largest companies in the world will no longer be public companies, but DAOs. DAOs buying public entities.
Yeah, yeah. And so say VitaDAO sees a really interesting longevity medical device or longevity drug in a distressed company.
Correct.
It's up for sale, Chapter 11. Could they buy it? And the answer is yeah. They could just buy it through a holding company, for example.
An LLC.
Yeah,
Delaware.
and they could use this. You can't see it over there, but they can use the IP holdco minting IPTs model, where VitaDAO forms an IP holdco that purchases the distressed IP from what is not a researcher, but it's now this company going under Chapter 11 bankruptcy or whatever. And then once they've purchased it, they can mint their IP NFT because the IP NFT is just registering your rights on chain, right? So again, it's kind of this very incremental thing. It's actually nothing out of the ordinary. You would just have the DAO essentially replace the regular company.
Correct.
And the DAO is now buying distressed assets it's registering the IP from those assets on chain, and then it can even use IPTs to fundraise for the purchase, or for the additional purchase, or for the continued research. Because probably in the case you're describing, there's probably a company that has cool IP, but it's not fully developed yet, right?
No.
Because the company's not successful. So
Yeah.
of course the IP wasn't a home run. So what they could do is they could buy that, mint the IP NFT, and then mint and sell IPTs to fund that next research milestone. To say, we know exactly how much it's going to cost to do this, to redo the phase 2 trial that failed for X or Y reasons, and then sell IPTs to raise that exact amount, and then do it.
It
Yeah,
just seems like a
awesome.
really quick iteration of a legal structure that would have to be set up in place.
Yeah, and that's the hope, right? Is that's why the DAO is so nice, because you remove this overhead of this whole legal structure, and that's my great hope, right? Is that ultimately these DAOs are just easier to form forms of company that can do a lot more, are a lot more flexible. I like to think of them kind of like as like the CIA or something. It's like this amorphous agency, it touches everything, and like you don't really know like where it is or where it's located, and it operates through a system of agents who kind of take ownership and agency and fill these gaps that are left in what is a pretty good system, the Joint Stock Corporation. It's gotten us very far, but I think that we can go further.
And further and further. Thank you so much, Jesse. Good luck.